At 06:10 on the morning of November 19th, 1944, Staff Sergeant Paul Wiedorfer crouched in a frozen Belgian ditch outside the village of Rockerath and stared at a weapon his company commander had just called a plumbing pipe with a romantic attachment to explosives. He was 24 years old, a former factory worker from Baltimore. 0 confirmed tank kills. The German armored column moving through the Krinkelter forest toward the twin villages of Rockerath-Krinkelt consisted of 14 Panzer IV tanks and 2 Panzer V Panthers. They were moving at dawn, using the tree line for cover, advancing along a farm road that American intelligence had declared impassable for armor 4 days earlier. The intelligence was wrong. The M1 Bazooka that Wiedorfer carried weighed 12 pounds empty. It was 54 inches long, a steel tube open at both ends with a wooden pistol grip, a simple iron sight, and a wire trigger attached to a battery in the handle. It fired a 60-millimeter rocket-propelled shaped charge. Effective range against armor, 100 yards under ideal conditions. The approaching Panthers had 80 millimeters of frontal armor. The bazooka's warhead could penetrate, under ideal conditions, 80 millimeters of armor plate. Ideal conditions. Not a frozen Belgian ditch. Not a crosswind coming out of the Ardennes. Not a nervous 24-year-old factory worker from Baltimore whose hands were shaking from cold or fear or both. The other man in Wiedorfer's section called the bazooka different things. Private DeLuca called it the stovepipe. Corporal Hines, who had once been a plumber in Cincinnati before the Army took him, called it the plumber's nightmare. Lieutenant Marsh, commanding the platoon, called it a theoretical weapon designed by men who had never seen a Panzer at close range. Marsh had ordered Wiedorfer to leave the bazooka in the supply tent 3 days earlier and carry a rifle like everyone else. Wiedorfer carried the bazooka anyway. The M1 Bazooka had been developed in 11 months. The Army Ordnance Department had approved the concept in May of 1942. The first production models were issued in August of 1942, barely 3 months before American soldiers first took them into combat in North Africa. Engineers who had spent careers designing artillery pieces and tank guns looked at the bazooka and shook their heads. It was too light, too simple, too dependent on a single man getting close enough to an armored vehicle to make a shot that required near-perfect angle and near-perfect distance. They were not wrong about the limitations, but they were wrong about the men. Wiedorfer had picked up the bazooka in September of 1944 during a supply reorganization outside Aachen. The original gunner in his section, a corporal from Ohio named Schuster, had been evacuated with trench foot. The platoon sergeant needed someone to carry the weapon. Wiedorfer volunteered. Not because he had training, not because he had experience with the weapon. He volunteered because the bazooka was the only thing in the American infantry arsenal that could stop a Panzer at close range, and Wiedorfer had watched too many men die from German armor that American rifles could not touch. He spent 3 days teaching himself to use it. He found a technical manual in a destroyed supply vehicle. The manual was 12 pages long. It described the weapon in engineering language that assumed the reader understood terms like shaped charge penetration and standoff distance. Wiedorfer did not understand those terms, but he understood the diagrams. He practiced loading and aiming on the edge of a bombed-out farm outside Aachen. He dry-fired the weapon 40 times until the motions became automatic. Then he waited. The Battle of the Bulge had not yet officially begun when Wiedorfer crouched in that frozen Belgian ditch on November 19, 1944. That would come in December. This was a different pressure, a preliminary German assault probing American lines east of the Siegfried Line. The 99th Infantry Division had been in Europe for only 3 weeks. Most of the men had never heard a Panzer engine at close range. Most of them heard it now. To understand what Paul Wiedorfer was about to attempt, you have to understand what a Panzer IV was. The Panzer IV was not the largest German tank in 1944. It was not the heaviest. The Tiger and the Panther had superseded it in raw power and armor. But the Panzer IV was everywhere. It was the workhorse of the Wehrmacht, produced in greater numbers than any other German armored vehicle, reliable and upgraded repeatedly since its introduction in 1936. By late 1944, the version rolling through the Krinkelter forest carried a 75mm high-velocity gun capable of defeating any American tank at combat range, and armor that could stop most American anti-tank weapons at distances greater than 200 yards. American infantry in 1944 had three options against a Panzer IV. They could call for artillery, which required radio contact, a forward observer, and time that close-range armor attacks did not allow. They could call for tank support, which required friendly armor to be close enough to respond, which was not always the case. Or they could use the bazooka. The M1 Bazooka had problems that every man who carried one knew. The backblast gave away the shooter's position. The rocket was sensitive to crosswinds. The shaped charge required a near-perpendicular impact to function correctly. The effective range was advertised as 100 yards, but experienced gunners considered 50 to 60 yards the realistic maximum for a reliable kill shot. 50 to 60 yards from a tank that carried a machine gun capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. The Germans had captured several bazookas in North Africa in late 1942. Their engineers studied the weapon and within months had produced their own version, the Panzerschreck, which fired a larger rocket with greater range and penetration. The Germans were impressed enough by the concept to copy it at industrial scale. The Americans, who had to use the original, remained skeptical. Lieutenant Marsh's skepticism was not unfounded. He had seen a bazooka team attempt to stop a Panzer IV outside Aachen in October. The gunner had fired from 80 yards, moving ground, imperfect angle. The rocket had struck the tank's side armor and detonated. The tank had kept moving. The crew had turned their Hull machine gun toward the rocket trail and killed the gunner and his loader in 4 seconds. Marsh had watched that happen from 200 yards away. He did not want to watch it happen to Wiedorfer. But Wiedorfer was in that ditch on November 19th because the company had run out of options in the time available. The German column was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. The road they were using had been mined the previous evening, but the lead tank had detonated 2 mines without being disabled. Its tracks had been damaged by the first mine, but repaired by the crew overnight. German panzer crews in late 1944 were experienced, adaptive, and stubborn in ways that the training manuals did not adequately describe. The column was now 400 yards from the first buildings of Rusherath Krinkelter. If the tanks reached the village, the man of the 99th Division's 2nd Battalion sheltering in those stone buildings would be fighting panzers from inside houses with rifles. Artillery support was 5 minutes away, minimum. Tank support was on the other side of the village, repositioning after a German feint attack from the east. Wiedorfer had the bazooka, 11 rockets, and a loader named DeLuca who had called the weapon a stovepipe 8 hours earlier, and now was loading it with the focused calm of a man who had decided that calm was the only alternative to panic. The first Panzer IV appeared at the bend in the farm road, 280 yards away. Wiedorfer watched it through the ditch embankment. The tank was moving at walking speed, maybe 5 miles per hour, its gun traversing slowly as the crew searched the tree line for threats. 2 infantry soldiers walked beside the tank, German grenadiers, providing close protection against exactly the kind of infantry anti-tank teams that Wiedorfer represented. 280 yards, far outside bazooka range. Wiedorfer did not fire. He pressed himself into the mud of the ditch and watched the column approach. The farm road ran along a slight depression in the Belgian countryside. On the left side, a frozen drainage ditch, 2 feet deep, concealed by dead grass and the overnight snow that had fallen across the Ardennes. On the right side, an open field that offered no cover at all. The tree line was 90 yards behind the road. Wiedorfer had selected the ditch as his position 2 hours before dawn. He had lain in it for those 2 hours. The temperature was 22 degrees Fahrenheit. He had a wool blanket wrapped around the bazooka tube to keep the launcher mechanism from seizing in the cold. He had his hands inside his coat when he was not gripping the weapon. His feet had stopped feeling distinctive sensations around 0400 and had begun reporting a single undifferentiated message: cold. He did not move. The technical manual had said nothing about lying still in a frozen Belgian ditch for 2 hours before a shot. But the man who had taught Wiedorfer the most about patience had not been in the technical manual. He had been a corporal named Bridges from Georgia, who had spent 4 years hunting deer in the Chattahoochee National Forest before the Army drafted him. Bridges had told Wiedorfer in September, during those 3 days of improvised bazooka training, that a man who could not wait was a man who would not shoot. "You wait until you cannot miss," Bridges had said. "If you can miss, you wait." Bridges had been killed by artillery fire outside Aachen on October 14th. He had never fired the bazooka in combat. But his lesson was in that Belgian ditch on November 19th, as real as the frozen mud. The German column continued its approach. The lead tank was now 180 yards out. The 2 infantry soldiers escorting it were 15 yards ahead of the tank, scanning the ditches with the practiced caution of men who understood the threat. Wiedorfer could see the infantry clearly. One of them was looking directly at the ditch where Wiedorfer lay. For 3 seconds, the German soldier's eyes swept across Wiedorfer's position. The dead grass and snow cover held. The soldier looked away. 140 yards. The tank's engine was loud now, a deep mechanical grinding that Wiedorfer felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. He could smell the exhaust, diesel and something else, something burned and metallic that came from the tank's heated metal and the cold air reacting around it. 100 yards. The lead tank crossed an invisible line in Wiedorfer's calculation. He had decided before dawn that he would fire from 60 yards, not because 60 yards was comfortable, because 60 yards was the point at which he was certain the rocket would reach the tank before any significant crosswind correction was necessary. At 60 yards, a bazooka rocket with moderate wind could still hit a moving target if the gunner led correctly. At 80 yards, the margin became uncertain. At 100 yards, it required either perfect conditions or exceptional skill that Wiedorfer did not claim to have. He claimed to have patience. He claimed to have the capacity to wait. He waited. 75 yards. DeLuca, lying behind Wiedorfer with the second rocket already in his hands, tapped Wiedorfer's right ankle once. Their prearranged signal. DeLuca was ready. 60 yards. Wiedorfer rose to his knees in one controlled motion. Shoulders, arms, weapon. The bazooka came up. He found the tank through the simple iron sight. The lead Panzer IV was presenting its left side, moving across his field of fire at a slight angle. Left side armor, 50 millimeters, inside the bazooka's theoretical penetration capability. He aimed for the running gear, just behind the front sprocket. The manual said the running gear was vulnerable. A track hit might not kill the crew, but a disabled tank on a narrow farm road would block every tank behind it. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket fired. The backblast from the bazooka tube erupted backward. Dead grass and snow vaporized in the exhaust blast. The German infantry soldiers 15 yards ahead of the tank turned toward the sound. The rocket crossed 60 yards in less than a second. It struck the Panzer IV's left track assembly. The explosion was smaller than Wiedorfer had expected. A sharp crack, a flash of orange-white, a spray of metal fragments from the track housing. The tank lurched, slewed left, and stopped. The left track had been blown off. The tank sat motionless, blocking the road, engine still running, crew uncertain what had just happened. Behind the lead tank, the column slowed. Wiedorfer dropped back into the ditch. DeLuca slid the second rocket into the tube. Wiedorfer heard the German infantry shouting. He heard the disabled tank's hatch beginning to open. He rose again. The second shot was harder. The German infantry had a general direction. One of them fired a burst from a submachine gun toward Wiedorfer's position, 20 yards wide of Wiedorfer's position, but close enough that the round snapped through the air above his head. Wiedorfer found the lead tank again. The hatch was open. The tank commander was emerging, looking for the source of the attack. Wiedorfer put the sight on the open hatch and fired. The second rocket entered the Panzer IV through the open commander's hatch. The explosion from inside the tank was catastrophic. The hatches blew open. Smoke poured from every seam. The tank did not burn immediately, but it was finished. No one emerged. Wiedorfer dropped back into the ditch. DeLuca had the third rocket ready. The column behind the destroyed lead tank was now stopped on a road too narrow to maneuver. The second tank was 30 yards behind the first, unable to pass on the left because of the drainage ditch, unable to pass on the right because of a stone wall running along the field edge. The column was a stationary target on a fixed road, and Paul Wiedorfer had 9 rockets left. What happened in the next 58 minutes would be documented in 2 after-action reports, one eyewitness statement from Lieutenant Marsh, and a German prisoner interrogation record recovered after the war from Wehrmacht archives in Freiburg. The accounts differ in some details. They agree on the essential facts. Wiedorfer killed 14 armored vehicles in under 1 hour, with a weapon his own officer had ordered him to leave in a supply tent. The methodology was not heroic in any cinematic sense. It was systematic. It was cold. It was the application of a simple tactical reality that Wiedorfer had understood from the moment he saw the road and the ditch and the stone wall on the field side. The column could not maneuver. A column that cannot maneuver is a column that can only sit still or reverse. Reversing takes time. Time was what Wiedorfer had. After the second shot destroyed the lead tank, Wiedorfer relocated 40 yards south along the ditch. The German infantry had the original firing position identified. They were moving toward it. Wiedorfer moved away from them without exposing himself above the ditch line. DeLuca followed, dragging the rocket bag through the frozen mud. From the new position, Wiedorfer had a clear angle on the second tank in the column. It was a Panzer IV, attempting to reverse, its left track scraping against the stone wall as the driver tried to create space to turn. The reversal process was slow. The tank was at a partial angle to Wiedorfer's position. Wiedorfer fired at the tank's rear engine compartment. The rear armor of a Panzer IV was 20 millimeters. The bazooka's shaped charge could penetrate 80 millimeters. The third rocket went through the rear armor and into the engine compartment. The tank burned. The crew bailed through the hatches. 2 of them were shot by American riflemen from the Rocherath-Krinkel perimeter who had moved into position along the tree line while Wiedorfer held the column's attention. The third crewman reached the far side of the road and disappeared into the field. The column was now anchored by 2 destroyed vehicles. Behind them, the remaining 12 tanks had no path forward, no room to turn, and a narrow road that forced them into a line rather than a fighting formation. A line of tanks is an artillery target, but artillery was still not available. Wiedorfer moved again, 20 yards north this time, back toward his original position. The German infantry had moved south following his last shot. He was now behind them. He loaded the 4th rocket. The third tank in the column was a Panther. It was the largest vehicle in the formation, its 75mm long barrel gun an entirely different category of threat than the Panzer IV's. A Panther's front armor was 80mm sloped at 55 degrees, effective penetration resistance far exceeding that specification. Against a Panther's front, a bazooka rocket was almost useless. Against the Panther's side, it was sufficient. Wiedorfer waited until the Panther began turning its turret away from his position, then rose and fired at the tank's side hull behind the turret ring. The fourth rocket penetrated. The tank did not immediately burn, but it stopped moving. The crew buttoned up. A buttoned-up tank on a blocked road with infantry around it is nearly blind. Blind tanks can be approached. Wiedorfer understood this. He loaded the fifth rocket. He did not fire from the ditch. He moved onto the road itself. He walked 14 steps toward the stopped Panther while the crew inside could not see him because their vision ports faced forward and to the sides, not directly behind. He pressed the bazooka against the back of the Panther's turret. The gap between the turret and the hull ring was 3 inches. He angled the tube and fired from contact distance. The fifth rocket entered the turret ring gap and detonated inside the turret. No one emerged from the Panther. By this point, the German infantry had retreated back toward the column. They had lost track of Wiedorfer in the confusion of burning vehicles and smoke and the rifle fire coming from the American tree line. The column's original infantry escort was 12 men. 4 of them were now dead from American rifle fire. The remaining 8 were sheltering behind the rearmost vehicles. Wiedorfer was now behind the column. He had 6 rockets remaining. The after-action report describes what happened next in sparse military language. Staff Sergeant Wiedorfer engaged remaining armored vehicles from rearward positions, utilizing the confusion created by multiple burning vehicles to approach within effective range of each target before firing. The report does not describe the smoke. It does not describe the sound of men trapped inside burning metal. It does not describe Wiedorfer moving through that smoke, rocket by rocket, tank by tank, with a 12-pound tube and a loader who kept handing him rockets and never once suggested they stop. But those things happened. At 07:14, Wiedorfer fired his 11th rocket at the 6th tank in the column, a Panzer IV, whose crew had partially dismounted and was attempting to use the tank as cover against the American rifle fire from the tree line. The rocket struck the tank's exposed fuel cell. The vehicle burned with enough intensity that the German infantry sheltering behind it had to abandon their position and move into the open field. At 07:28, Wiedorfer fired at a Panzer IV that had managed to turn partially sideways on the road, its crew making a desperate attempt to create a hull-down defensive position using the burning lead tank as cover. The rocket struck the hull above the running gear. The tank stopped moving permanently. At 07:41, Wiedorfer fired his last 2 rockets in sequence at the remaining mobile vehicle, a Panzer IV, whose driver had reversed 30 yards and was attempting to escape backwards down the farm road. The first rocket missed. Wiedorfer watched the rocket pass 2 feet wide of the tank's hull and detonate against the road embankment behind it. He chambered the final rocket without expression and fired again. The second rocket hit the tank's rear sprocket assembly. The tank stopped. 58 minutes after Wiedorfer's first shot, the German armored column on the Krinkelter Forest Road consisted of 14 destroyed or disabled vehicles, producing enough smoke to be visible from Henderson Field had it been in Belgium rather than Guadeloupe. Paul Wiedorfer climbed out of the ditch. He was carrying an empty bazooka tube and a wool blanket that had been scorched by backblast at some point he could not specifically recall. DeLuca was behind him, carrying the empty rocket bag. Wiedorfer walked back toward the American lines.
Lieutenant Marsh met him at the tree line. Marsh had watched the entire engagement from the tree line with the rifle platoon. He had directed his riflemen to engage the German infantry escort throughout the action. Without Marsh's riflemen suppressing the German infantry, Wiedorfer's approach to the Panther at close range would likely have been fatal. Marsh had also been the officer who called the bazooka a theoretical weapon. He did not say anything about that now. He asked Wiedorfer if he was hit. Wiedorfer looked at himself. He had mud on every surface of his uniform. His right hand had a cut across the palm from a piece of metal fragment he did not remember receiving. His ears were ringing from the multiple backblast discharges. He was, by any clinical measurement, functional. He told Marsh he was not hit. Marsh told him that artillery support had arrived and was now targeting the road. Wiedorfer told Marsh that the road no longer required artillery support. He was correct.
The debrief took place at 99th Division headquarters at 1400 hours on November 19th. Wiedorfer sat across from a divisional intelligence officer named Major Cartwright and described what had happened on the farm road with the precision of a man reporting on a routine task. 14 vehicles engaged, 11 rocket hits that produced confirmed destruction or disablement, 2 misses, 1 probable from the contact shot on the Panther. Cartwright stopped him at the contact shot. He asked Wiedorfer to repeat what he had done. Wiedorfer repeated it. He had walked onto the road. He had placed the bazooka against the back of the Panther's turret ring. He had fired. Cartwright was quiet for a moment. Then he asked why. Wiedorfer said that the Panther's frontal and side armor were difficult targets for the bazooka at combat range. The turret ring was a known vulnerability. Getting close enough to use it was a problem of concealment and timing, not of courage. The burning vehicles provided smoke. The German infantry escort had been suppressed by Marsh's riflemen. The conditions for the shot existed. He had used them. Cartwright wrote this down. He asked Wiedorfer how he had learned Panther vulnerability specifications. Wiedorfer said he had found a captured German tank manual in a destroyed half-track outside Aachen and had spent 2 evenings reading it with the help of a German-speaking private from Wisconsin. Cartwright wrote this down too. The intelligence report that followed the November 19th engagement was circulated within 1st Army headquarters by November 23rd. It described what the official language called improvised anti-armor tactics of notable effectiveness by individual infantry personnel operating without direct support. The report recommended that bazooka training be revised to include engagement at ranges below 60 yards, that tank vulnerability specifications be distributed to bazooka teams at company level, and that the psychological willingness to approach armored vehicles at close range be specifically addressed in training doctrine. The report did not mention Wiedorfer by name. It described his actions as those of an unnamed staff sergeant, 99th Infantry Division, 2nd Battalion. Wiedorfer received the Silver Star. The citation read in part that he displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in single-handedly engaging and destroying multiple enemy armored vehicles, thereby preventing the enemy column from reaching friendly positions. The citation did not mention the plumbing pipe. It did not mention Lieutenant Marsh's order to leave the weapon in the supply tent. It did not mention DeLuca calling it a stovepipe, or the armorer at Camp Maxey who had looked at the bazooka and said that anyone who thought they could stop a Panzer with a cardboard rocket and a wish was welcome to try. The citation said what citations say. The reality was something the citation could not fully contain. 3 weeks later, the German army launched Operation Wacht am Rhein. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944, with the largest German offensive on the Western Front since the fall of France. 3 German armies, 200,000 men, 600 tanks and assault guns attacked along an 85-mile front through the Ardennes. The target was the port of Antwerp. The method was to split the Allied line, encircle the northern armies, and force a negotiated peace before American industrial production made the war's outcome inevitable. The 99th Infantry Division was directly in the path of the German main effort. Racheroth-Krinkelt, the twin villages that Wiedorfer had defended on November 19th, became the scene of the most intense fighting the 99th would ever experience. German armored columns, larger and more determined than the November probe, struck the American positions with everything they had. The same farm road that Wiedorfer had blocked 3 weeks earlier was again a German approach route. Wiedorfer was there again. The December engagements were different from November. The German force was not a probing column of 14 tanks. It was a sustained assault involving multiple battalions of infantry supported by constant armor. The Americans defending Racheroth-Krinkelt fought in the streets, in the stone buildings, in the cellars, from positions that were overrun and retaken within the same hour. The fighting was chaotic in ways that the November engagement had not been. In that chaos, Wiedorfer used the bazooka 5 more times over 3 days of fighting. 3 hits, 2 misses, 2 additional tanks destroyed. The conditions in December were nothing like the controlled approach of November. They were close range, confused, often conducted from inside buildings or around the corners of stone walls, with German infantry within grenade range. The bazooka that nobody wanted became, in those 3 days, the primary reason that several positions held long enough for relief to arrive. A replacement soldier, a private from Tennessee named Corbin, who had arrived at the 99th in November and had never seen combat before Racheroth-Krinkelt, later wrote in a letter home that the only thing between them and the German tanks on the second day was a sergeant with a pipe that looked like it belonged under a kitchen sink. Corbin wrote that the sergeant never seemed afraid. He was wrong about that. Fear was present in every position Wiedorfer took, in every calculation about distance and angle, and the question of whether the rocket would penetrate or simply crack harmlessly off sloped armor and leave him standing in the open with an empty tube and a German tank 40 yards away. But fear and effectiveness are not mutually exclusive. They never were. The men who matter in a moment of crisis are not the men who feel no fear. They are the men who feel it completely and act anyway, who stand up in a ditch when the calculation says it is time to stand up, who walk onto a road toward a panther because the conditions are right and the mission requires it, who carry a weapon their officer ordered them to leave behind because they have looked at the situation and concluded that the weapon is needed. Wiedorfer was not fearless. He was something more useful than fearless. He was practical. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945, with the German offensive exhausted and the Allied line restored. The 99th Infantry Division had suffered 4,154 casualties. It had killed or captured an estimated 20,000 German soldiers and destroyed or disabled more than 100 armored vehicles. For a division that had been in Europe for less than 2 months when the battle began, the performance was extraordinary. The Army later credited the 99th's stubborn defense of the northern shoulder of the Bulge with preventing the German breakthrough from reaching its full operational potential. Historians would argue about those assessments for decades. What is not subject to argument is what the farm road outside Racheroth looked like on December 20, 1944. American engineers photographed it for the Army's historical record. The photographs show 14 destroyed German armored vehicles on a farm road in Belgium. Some are burned beyond recognition. Some are simply stopped, their tracks blown off, their hulls intact, but their crews gone. Snow has begun to cover them. They look like industrial wreckage, like a factory floor where something went badly wrong. They look like the result of a weapon that nobody wanted, fired by a man nobody expected. Paul Wiedorfer survived the war. He was discharged from the Army in September of 1945. The Silver Star and 2 other decorations went into a box. He returned to Baltimore and found work in the same industrial sector that had employed him before the draft. He married in 1947. He had 3 children. He did not speak publicly about the Ardennes engagement for nearly 20 years. When he did speak, it was not to journalists or historians. It was to a group of ROTC cadets at a Maryland university who had asked him to discuss anti-armor tactics. He brought the M1 Bazooka that he had kept, with Army permission, after the war. He put it on the table in front of the cadets and let them look at it. Then he told them what a technical manual could not say. He told them about lying in a frozen ditch for 2 hours while a Panzer column approached. He told them about bridges from Georgia and the lesson about patience and the shot you take only when you cannot miss. He told them about the wool blanket wrapped around the launcher mechanism to keep it from seizing in the cold. He told them about DeLuca in the mud behind him, with a rocket in each hand, and the calm of a man who had decided that calm was the only option. He told them about the Panther, about the 14 steps onto the road, about pressing the tube against the turret ring and firing from contact distance because the conditions were right and the mission required it. A cadet asked him if he had been afraid. Wiedorfer said that fear was a piece of information. It told you what was dangerous. A man who felt no fear was a man receiving no information about his environment. That man would make mistakes that a frightened man might not make, because the frightened man was paying attention. He said that fear was useful. It was panic that killed you. He picked up the bazooka from the table and turned it over in his hands. He said that the men who had called it a plumbing pipe had not been wrong about the object. They had been wrong about what it meant in the hands of a man who understood it. The tube was 54 inches long. It weighed 12 pounds. It had a wooden pistol grip and a wire trigger and an iron sight that a factory worker from Baltimore had aimed through the dead grass of a Belgian ditch at the most powerful armored force in the history of land warfare. It had been enough. The M1 Bazooka was officially retired from American military service in 1957. It had been in service for 15 years across 2 major conflicts, in the hands of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who carried it through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Germany, the Pacific Islands, and Korea. The weapon's reputation followed a predictable arc: dismissed before combat, redeemed in it, studied afterward by men who needed to understand how a 12-pound tube had managed to stop armored formations that artillery and air power had failed to stop in time. The answer the studies kept finding was not about the weapon. It was about the men. The bazooka worked when the man carrying it understood its limitations precisely enough to find the conditions where those limitations did not apply, when he was patient enough to wait for those conditions, when he was willing to close the distance that the weapon required, when he was practical enough to read a captured enemy technical manual in the ruins of an Aachen farmhouse and learn where the armor was thin. Paul Wiedorfer died in 1994. He was 74 years old. The bazooka he had carried in the Ardennes was donated to the National Infantry Museum in Fort Benning, Georgia, where it sits in a display case alongside other weapons of the Second World War. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It looks like a pipe, like something from a hardware store, like nothing that could matter against the industrial machinery of a Panzer division. But on a farm road outside Rockereth Crinkelt, in November of 1944, on a frozen morning when the column could not maneuver and an American sergeant would not stop, it mattered in ways that the men who called it a plumbing pipe had never imagined. 14 tanks, 58 minutes, 11 rockets, one man who understood that the weapon was only the beginning of the calculation. The rest was patience and the willingness to stand up when it was time.